the mock or the prelim. I was talking about the word, the prelim exams. The point here would be that if you're typing your answers out, can you please follow normal writing convention? Meaning, you should format your paper, justify it. Justify is in like, the whether it's left align or center align, right align or justified. No, the alignment should be justified. Please use a standard font, right? So something that is like Times New Roman or Arial or something that is very clear, easy to read. A size 12 font. I received some papers that was a size 10 in Calibri, or there was another one that was in Comic Sans and things like that, and very small, no spacing, no proper paragraphing, right? One big idea for in each paragraph. Sometimes you get one paragraph for the entire essay. These kinds of things do make a difference. Please remember, the marker is not only looking at your paper, the marker is looking at several other papers as well. So make it clear and easy for the marker to read your answers. And one more thing, as a result of there being a word limit, right? Things like your in-text citations, normal convention, that means normal citation convention, right? In-text citations and headers are included in the word limit. That means this is something that is standard information across the board. That means nothing to do specifically with UOL, what they're asking you for in exams and so on. Your bibliography or your reference list is not included in the word limit, but headers, all those, any headers that you use, like introduction, body of paragraph, that kind of headers, right? And all your in-text citations are actually included in the word limit, right? So please take note of this also. I noticed some students will try to, work around this and write the, word limit saying that, 1,000 words, excluding citations and headers. It doesn't work like that. You can't make your own rules as to what's included and excluded in the word limit. All right. So these are things that I would like to point out to you right now. Later on, you look out for the instructions from UOL. That one, you can look out for that, right? But and that one they will inform you later on, and it's nothing to do with me. But this one is explaining to you what I know about what citation conventions are and how you should prep. Right. So please don't play around with these kinds of things. Markers can be very strict. After 1,000 words, they will not mark. Right, or they need not mark. All right, so please pay attention to that. Okay, let me come back to this. So 23 countries signed the GATT, right? When you talk about the GATT, please include the second bullet point on the slide, right? It is an unprecedented multilateral treaty. It's a treaty, number one. That is what you want to emphasize. So underline that, please. And number two, it's unprecedented, right? You did not have an organization prior to this that was basically looking at how to create norms, standardizations, to address what are the rules and decision-making procedures and principles that the international society needs to lay down in order to regulate international trade, right? Because go back to the original discussion of what the role and function of international organizations are in the international political system, right? What is the role and function of organizations? Why is it that you have an increase in the number of organizations? Please make the connection down here. Write it down if you need to. Right, that the original intention, right, behind creating a lot of these organizations is that as the interaction among states increase with as the years go by, right, what you need is to have international organizations to regulate their interactions, to monitor their interactions, because as a result of increased interactions, you are also going to end up inadvertently, right, with disputes or disagreements, right? Therefore, you will need to not only have organizations that are able to lay down, okay, that these are the standard conventions when it comes to interacting with each other on, in the field of trade, number one. Number two, you also need to have dispute resolution mechanisms. When you refer to the WTO in next week's discussion, the dispute resolution mechanism will be a big part of the discussion in terms of the importance of the organization, right? But when you talk about GATT, right, the foundation, right, is to explain, bring it back to the idea of the role, the function, the need for international organization. So don't just tell the story, right? Make it analytical. Okay, and specifically, notice the phrasing in the second bullet point. It refers specifically to standards, rules, decision-making procedures, right? What does that remind you of? It reminds you of the definition for regimes, right? So even before you start off explaining that GATT is a regime, like what we saw being discussed under lecture 4, where we talked about liberalism, right? And then we talked about the regimes, right? And we discussed Krasner. Remember that, the regime. This is where you would already indicate to the marker that you are au fait with the idea of regimes, right? And GATT is a representation of that, because the definition for regimes also includes the idea of norms, practices, principles, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge, right? With regard to solving a specific issue that is confounding the international system. Right? So that is the definition for regime, and you want to reference it, in your initial description of GATT, and then go on to highlight that subsequently. So that will increase the analytical angle of your exam answer, right? So the original intention behind GATT, or behind this motivation for creating an organization relating to trade, is arising from the Bretton Woods mandate. about creating an organization, right, or an institution that will be able to handle the trade aspect of international economic cooperation, right? So this is something that you would also need to include maybe in the paragraph after the introduction, right, when you're giving that background or the overview of the organization, right? So you want to explain that that the financial organizations, right, dealing with the financial health of the international system versus the trade aspect, there are two different there's a distinction between the two. Please do not conflict IMF, World Bank, and GATT or WTO, right? It's all dealing with economics, right? So look at the question, right? Is the question asking you about the health of the economic system? What specifically is the focus? Especially if it's the open-ended questions, how did the international organizations created, in the Bretton Woods era or the post-World War II era contribute to the economic system? So if it's just a generic approach, if it says to deal with economic cooperation, how have international organizations contributed to economic cooperation? Or a question that asks you about organizations that are relevant to the international system in an era of globalization, right? So economic cooperation, globalization, then you could include, a discussion of GATT. You could talk about WTO, you could talk about IMF and World Bank, right? But if it specifically says trade, then it has to be GATT and WTO. If it specifically says finance, right, because finance refers to loans, it refers to foreign exchange, it refers to monetary policy, and so on, then that would refer to IMF and World Bank. If the question asks you, what contributions have international organizations made to the financial stability of states, then financial stability would remind you that it's IMF and World Bank. If it says economic development, then you could talk about IMF, World Bank, as well as the trading organizations. So you need to look at, what is the question referring to? How is it phrased, right? Before you decide which organizations you are going to refer to. Sorry, what's my laptop? Which organizations you're going to refer to. Do you understand? And very importantly, remember this, you have 12 questions to choose from. If at any one point you see this type of open-ended questions and you are not exactly sure which type of organization the question is asking you to focus on, right, then I would suggest that you reevaluate your question choices. Because if you're confused or if you are hesitant, right, like which one is it that they're asking you to focus on, the open-ended questions, right, then don't take a risk. In case, the examiner is actually expecting you to discuss GATT and WTO, but you ended up discussing IMF and World Bank because your interpretation of the open-ended question differed, right? Or there was a misinterpretation. Then you could be running the risk of writing an answer that actually is not answering the question. So this is I'm spending a bit of time to explain this because I do not want anyone to waste that one set of marks, right? If you mistakenly use the wrong organization, to illustrate the answer. You understand? So please pay very close attention. Please write it down somewhere in your notes right now. Right? Please pay very close attention to how the questions are being phrased. Go and look. I would recommend, right? For these kind of purposes, right? If you haven't already, please go and download. I'm very sure the commentaries, the exam commentaries are available to y'all, right? When y'all go to the exam preparation resources in the VLE, y'all have access to the commentaries as well, right? Correct? Am I right? I know the exam. Yeah. Okay. Please go and take a look. Go and search in the commentaries that are available. Right. The last 2 to 3 years. I think they upload 3 years worth of papers for you every time. Take a look at the phrasing of the questions, right, and look at what the focus of the answer is, especially for the open-ended ones. Then you'll be able to clearly see what I'm trying to explain to you. Right. Okay. All right. So finally, when you look at the interwar period. Right. The rationale is that that there needed to be an impetus, right, to or a push, right, to push free trade. Because remember, when you're looking at the interwar period or the pre-World War II period, that is prior to that, right, what basically characterized the international system or characterized the attitudes of states? To go back to that, make a link to that. What basically characterized the attitudes of states? States were basically wearing their realist lenses, and part of wearing their realist lenses, right, because it is an idea of pursuit of materialism. Remember. Right, what materialism is about. Materialism is basically about the pursuit of anything that contributes to economic or military prowess. Has to do with the pursuit and of hard power, basically, right? And what do you see states doing? Basically, they have protectionist tendencies, right? Even after the League of Nations, also, right, with the failure of the League of Nations, states tended to in the period of the interwar period of Great Depression and so on, right? They were basically reverting to protectionism. Right, so that's the rationale down here. Free trade basically needed an impetus, right? Because IMF and World Bank were designed to basically create a stable, economic, structure or a framework, right? So their logic was that if you adjust the domestic economic structures, right, of each of these states, and their economies are healthy, right, they are not struggling with debt, and they are able to hop on the bandwagon of development, right, then that would contribute to states being able to trade with each other because your economies are healthy, right, and then you are able to lower your barriers of protection, right, or sorry, lower your barriers of entry, and then start trading with each other. So the idea was that IMF and World Bank were basically contributing to settling these issues on a domestic level, right, helping states, or the intention was to help states to make improvements to their domestic economies. So that is how we say that IMF and World Bank were not designed to do anything else besides help create an environment conducive to unrestricted international trade, right? Because that is how you create an environment, right? That will be conducive to international trade. So that is the rationale down here. So there wasn't right any other organization that was able to deal with the pressures of international trade. So that's why, like I told you, cross-reference to the original intentions of creating IMF World Bank, right, to explain why this third economic organization, economic-based organization, is in the field of economics, right? Yeah, so you can call it an economic organization or a third organization to dealing with economics and finance in the international system, right, was actually necessary because IMF and World Bank did not have a mandate. They did not have the mandate to actively encourage states to pursue free trade. That was not their issue area. So there is a gap, right? And the gap therefore needs to be plugged by an organization, right? Which eventually turned out to be the GATT, right? So IMF, basically, what is IMF about? Creating structural conditions for sustainable economic growth, looking at short-term lending, looking at monetary policy on a domestic level that would then contribute to the overall health of the international financial system. World Bank, right, was looking at the aspects of post-war recovery, lending to developing countries, right, to basically ameliorate structural inequalities for the purpose of economic growth and development, right? So there's a gap, right, and that was what would be filled by an organization such as the WTO, right? But of course, we didn't see the WTO in the immediate period, okay. All right. In the immediate period, when GATT was actually created, right? So what do you need to, basically explain? That you have, the realization of the global leaders that they do not want to make the same mistakes of, the 1920s, right? So that is what post-World War II recovery basically is about. That you need to rethink the idea of trade barriers and protectionism, right? And how that can have adverse effects on the economic system, right? Because it trade eventually dried up, leading to economic ruin. That's a very nice phrase to use, right? As in, why do you need to talk about economic ruin from the World War II recovery period? Because only if you explain what the background is, that means what is it about the international environment that requires an organization, so that shows you the motivation of creating the organization, right? So the rationale is that as a result of the recovery period in the post World War II era, you needed to have an overhaul of the entire international and political economic system that now would go towards the idea of stability and a global community. So this is where you drag in the idea of multilateralism, right? Because remember what multilateralism is all about: sovereign states that three or more sovereign states. If you go back to the Ruggie definition that we saw in lecture 1, right, and lecture 5, for instance, right, you would be able to explain that multilateralism is states that are sovereign, right, a group of states that are sovereign coming together in order to collaborate and to tap on each other's capacities in order to solve problems in the international system, right? And the idea is that no longer that is the definition of multilateralism. The other aspect is that no longer do you really want to have trading relations that are based on just bilateral practices. So it's no longer about having this secret, exclusive little club, right, among like-minded states. That you need to have a multilateral approach to states. So that is why it becomes it takes on an international aspect, right? And I like the phrasing that we use when we discuss the state of trade in the international system. There was a need for order into the world jungle of trade, right? It's a very nice analogy to use. I actually copied it from the the vintage videos, one of the vintage videos that I linked for you in the slides prior to this, right? When you watch the video, you will see the use of that phrasing or the analogy, world jungle of trade. Because what is the world jungle of trade? Why is that actually such a good analogy? And I would say it still actually applies not just to the post World War II period, but I would say that it still technically applies to looking at the international trading system today, right? Because when you look at the world jungle of trade, when you look at jungle, right, what is the main idea behind a jungle? It's free, it's wild, right? There's no regulation, right? So that is the main idea there. And then in the jungle, what do you have? You've got predator versus prey. Right. So who is the predator and who is the prey? Obviously, developed states which have already experienced industrialization and stability and have attained a particular level of economic growth, then would be able to function more like the predators, right? And your smaller or your developing economies, which are attempting to hop on to the bandwagon of development, right, are the ones that fall prey to the predator, the predators, right, which is the developed states. So you can think of it in terms of they're very attractive to the predators in the sense that they have high levels of natural resources. They are states that are rely on lower level economic activities like agricultural sectors, some types of manufacturing and so on. And the other thing that they offer is cheap labor, cheap and freely available labor, right? So this analogy helps you to understand a little bit more clearly, right? The logic of the world jungle of trade. So it's not just predator versus prey, but the idea is that it's wild, it's unregulated, right? So that's the rationale down here. Big countries that were already, in a position to dominate the global economic system could basically eat up the smaller countries, the predator, please don't refer it to as predator states and prey states, because predator states, if you I use the analogy of predator and prey to explain to you, all right? But if you refer to predator states, right, in comparative politics, that has got, a separate connotation altogether. So I would not use the exact phrasing predator versus prey in your exam answer. That is for you to understand, right? Maybe how you could explain it, in the exam would be to say like your bigger or your developed countries, right? Or the countries in the global north, which had already experienced development and industrialization, they were already in a position to dominate the global economic system, and they could basically eat up, right? That means overtake, exploit, extract, right? That's the logic of eat up, right? Smaller countries, if there were no rules, right? And at the same time, they could also exert more pressure. That's the logic down here. If they, not only would they be able to, take advantage of these states, right? But they would actually be able to exert a lot of pressure in terms of, extracting goods, natural resources, or, creating an environment that would actually continuously benefit, right, the developed states, right? That means constantly you are placing the smaller developing states, right, under the firm thumb of the developed states, right? So if there's no rules, right, then they would be able to exert a lot of pressure, right, on these developing states. So as opposed to when if they all existed in a multilateral system where every state, as a result of being sovereign, right, has a means of having itself heard, having disputes being resolved, and so on. Correct? That's the logic down here, right? So that is why. But like I said, please do not. Can you please write it down there? Please do not use the predator state, because predator state has got a different meaning. When you look at it in political science, right? And why is this important, right? Because your developing states seem to face problems of deficits in balance of payment, right? None of them, at this point had actually allowed free imports from developing countries. So the only way to, to address all of this is to address, what are the main problems? The main problems is if you have tariffs, right, or you have non-tariff barriers. Basically, anything that is considered a barrier to entry would adversely impact on the volume of world trade, right? Because if you make imports more expensive, if you make it more expensive to export, if you have all of these different systems to make it more expensive for these developing countries to freely import and export, then their costs go up. They will not be able to participate freely in world trade, right? So in the long run, that will also adversely affect the developed states. But in the immediate short run, the developing countries are the ones that will not be able to generate enough trade volume in order to adjust their economic systems, right? Because they will not be able to generate enough income, right? So that makes it very problematic. Okay, all right. So this here, right, is the discussion about why it was necessary to have an organization. All right, to start off with, that means we are not discussing the idea of GATT yet, right? But we're discussing the motivation of the organization. So what this tells you, and why this is important to include in your exam answer, right? Whether you're talking about WTO or GATT, right, is the idea that an organization related to trade was seen to be imperative. That means you have to have an organization that deals with creating or attempting to normalize, or attempting to even out the playing field of international trade. It's absolutely important. And this, if you do not discuss this, right, then when you want to discuss how GATT came about to be, then there will be a gap in your information, right? Because the logic here is that GATT wasn't actually intended, right? GATT wasn't actually intended to be the main organization that was dealing with international trade. So what you're trying to show down here is that it was this having an organization dedicated, right, to international trade was seen to be so critical to the recovery of the international economic system, right, and to the balancing out between the developed and the developing states, right, and trying to bring the developing states on board. So that means the need or the urgency for an organization dedicated to trade, international trade, was absolutely critical, right? And then what happens is that you have not an organization, but you have a regime instead that was suddenly pushed, right, and made to bear the burdens, right, of or the responsibility, you can either use burden or responsibility, made to bear the burdens or the responsibilities of regulating the international trade system. It was merely, and this is where you can emphasize this, right, it was merely a regime. GATT was merely a regime. It was actually not intended or not designed, right, to fulfill all of these requirements of an organization that was going to regulate the international trading system, right? But it so happened that GATT had to fulfill this job, right? And it's so critical, right? So if you do not explain this background down here, right, about the importance of having a trade organization, right, in like what we discussed in the post World War II era, then when you want to highlight that this poor little GATT, right, that was simply just a regime having to fill in the shoes of the International Trade Organization, which eventually didn't take off, then you would be able to show that despite not being an international organization, it was able to achieve what it has achieved. Can you see why in this particular discussion, right, the motivation of creating, a trade-related international organization is very critical. If you do not explain this background, right, then anything else you explain about the GATT becomes just very descriptive. It just says GATT did X, Y, and Z. But rather than GATT did X, Y, and Z, right, despite not being designed to do X, Y, and Z. That is the main kicker, right, in this entire discussion. You understand? Everybody clear on this, right? If you do not explain the background, right, then you will not be able to push the argument in that direction. Okay, all right. Before I go to this part here, let me just quickly run through this discussion down here. Okay, like I said, for those who came in later a bit, right, this is already uploaded for you in the eGlobal. So please, take a look at it for a refresher. So number one, I do not like to use first world versus second world in the third world countries. Usually I do not really use these kinds of phrasing. I prefer to use global north versus global south or use developed versus developing. All right. So this one gives you a little bit of background on the idea of the conceptual change. All right. Okay. So, some scholars even, go further to say, don't use the phrasing global south, but, we can still use the idea of global south. Or if you're uncomfortable, just use, developed versus developing. I think that would actually basically be easier to refer to, right? Because then it is a broader categorization because you have states that are moving from, different economic statuses, right? So, if you're talking about transitioning countries and you do not want to make an inaccurate description, then what you can do is basically just refer to them as developed versus developing, right? Or if you are familiar with the world systems theory, right, then you can use core versus peripheral versus semi-peripheral states, right? Okay. I would make a distinction between what is the meaning of development. Development, if you read the Bailey's textbook, right, from right off the bat, they basically tell you development is actually a very extremely contested term, right? Meaning that there are different ways to look at what development basically is about, right? So when you look at development, what you want to make a distinction is that and a lot of people do not make this distinction, right? Is to say, when they talk about states being developed, they always, refer to economic indicators of development, like, GDP growth, inflation, employment, purchasing power parity, and so on. This is, when they say, oh, a state is developed. But, we always ask this question in IR, right? And I think it's a commonsensical question. Yeah, so what if a state basically has achieved, GDP growth, 6% GDP growth? Does that mean that everybody in that state is enjoying the benefits of that 6% GDP growth? It doesn't make sense to me, right? And it doesn't make sense to a lot of scholars who, subscribe to the idea of critical development or the social aspect of development. So what you need to, reconsider is how development can be measured, right? So development today, right, from the critical, right, economic development is referred to, okay, let me write it down for you, right, in the chat box. Economic development, right, can also be understood as orthodox approach, right? It means traditional orthodox approach, right? So that is, how it is traditionally been measured. The critical development, right? Critical development. So here is like, what we're referring to, the social aspect of development is considered, considered to be a more comprehensive, holistic approach to I cannot spell today, understanding development. All right, so the social aspect of development is measured by things like sustainable development, inclusion of citizens in democratic decision-making procedures, right? The idea of the idea of communities being self-sufficient, participating in, democratic decision-making in terms of being able, having the decision-making procedures closer to them, because the logic is that you have all of these at-risk, vulnerable communities that tend to fall through the cracks, right? They do not have maybe access to leaders, the state leaders. They may not have access to, like, in this era where you have things like e-government, for instance, right? If you are poor, right, and if you are not as well educated as, say, for example, the middle class or the youth population, and if you have the government shifting to, say, e-government or digital government structures where public goods and services are being provided on a digital platform, or you need to access them via a digital platform, and you are digitally illiterate, for example, meaning, you do not know how to use laptop or smartphones and so on, or you do not have access to this laptop and smartphones and so on. How do you access these public goods and services which are actually meant for you to access? And these are the people who require the use of public goods and services, but they do not have access to it because, of the digital gap, right? Or, they're digitally illiterate and so on. Or things, so that means, their communication capabilities are lacking. Or they, have discrepancies in approaches to health. So, for example, average life expectancy or infant mortality rates, where, the poorer, quarters of the community are not able to access public health, right? So that's why, in certain, say, for example, in African states, right, they measure maternal health infant mortality, they look at average life expectancy and so on, right? So that is the social, aspect of development. It is about sustainable development, not, harming the environment. So it has an environmental angle. It, thinks of, it takes into consideration security. So, when you talk about security, human security, I'm sure you are familiar with this phrase, right? So, you look at human security, looking at personal security, food security, water security, employment security, and so on. You're looking at the idea of being included in, democratic decision-making procedures because, these people may be excluded from participating actively in making their preferences and their needs known to the leaders, right? So that is where we have a distinction. So it's very different from your orthodox understanding of what development actually is about, right? Okay, right. So you need to take into consideration both aspects before you can basically say that a state is considered to be developed, right? So then you make a distinction between your developed and your developing states. So states in the global north, they tend to have they're already in an advantageous position. So please do not say all states or all developing states are in this position, but temper your discussion by saying several developed states or states in the global north, they experience some semblance of stability in terms of democratic structures, right? So they are they may not be perfect full democracies, right? But at least they have some levels of stability. They've got active civil societies. They are already in an advantageous position because of their relative wealth, right? And they sometimes are faced with certain phenomena, right? Say like refugee or asylum seekers or immigration. But when you look at the global states, they have it hard. Sorry, the global south states or the developing states, they basically have it harder because you tend to see similar trends or patterns, right? So notice the language I'm using is also very neutral, right? Not boxing myself into a corner by saying all states are like this, right? But basically saying that they tend to experience political instability. There is you have weak institutions, right? So you may have poor governance as opposed to good governance structures, right? You may have poor governance, you may have institutionalized systemic corruption, right? Systemic, not systematic. A lot of people always confuse the phrase systematic with systemic. So systemic corruption, that means it's basically something that is endemic. You see it everywhere, right? It becomes a norm, right? So things like corruption, weak institutions, mismanagement of the economy. You may see power vacuums and subsequently coups, right? And you may also see civil war. And there's a constant, fight among all of the different, in an extreme case, right? There's a fight or a competition among all of these competing groups to access, whatever scarce public resources that are available, right? So what happens is that when you make this comparison, between your global south and your global north states, you're already putting them in a position to say that this is why you need to have the international community having structures or frameworks or organizations that would help to even out this imbalance that actually occurs, right? Okay, then you have other questions. Some countries are able to economically progress or develop, and others, have not. So this is a question that is asked in comparative politics. You could get a variation of this question in your exam. Saying that there are some countries that have not been able to economically develop or have been left behind by globalization. How would international organizations in this field, be able to address this major problem? You could get a combination, right, of this focus with the international organizations, right? So think about the theories like modernization theory or dependency theory, right? Underdevelopment. As a result of low social level and cultural modernization. I like to use dependency theory, or otherwise known as the world systems theory, where you have the exploitation by rich states of poor states that consistently places them in a position where it's a vicious cycle, right? They're consistently dependent on the poorer states or the periphery or the semi-peripheral states, right? They are consistently dependent on the core states. So the very easy way to explain it is your world systems theory, right? So this one I think you should know already. The core states tend to engage in higher level economic activities like banking, finance, right? And basically they are able to capitalize, right, on this advantageous position that they already have as a result of being industrialized, right? And the first phases of industrialization, right, using and they how did they do it, right? Basically they were able to do it by using the resources or the commodities that they extracted at very low rates, right? That means very cheaply from the peripheral and the semi-peripheral states, right? And unfortunately, the states that are in the periphery are also subject to similar trends of exploitation or extraction by the semi-peripheral countries as well, right? So that means, you would say, looking at this diagram, right, what basically you understand is that the states in the periphery are doubly disadvantaged by their position, which why you can easily explain that they remain trapped, right, in this economic structure. They tend to remain poor, right? So the idea is that the impoverished countries of the global south are continuously dependent, right, on the global north, for industrial products, for foreign aid, for capital, right, increasing if you watch the debate style video from the IMF lecture, right, the one about the Jamaica, and remember we watched it, what the Jamaican professor was teaching the class, and he said that increasingly the imports become more and more expensive, and everything, a lot of their critical commodities, right, are basically imported. So imported fuel, imported food, imported goods and products that become necessary on a daily basis, the logic is that they are unable to produce it themselves, right? As a result of very basic logic of comparative advantage, for instance, right? So they have no choice but to rely on import, right? And imports become more and more expensive, right? Especially if they're structured, especially if they're subjected to economic liberalization that forces them to reduce barriers of entry, forces them to make adjustments to the valuation of their currency, and so on. Right, so that is the rationale down here. So that is why I included this discussion here, because without having an understanding of this at least, then you wouldn't be able to explain certain important concepts when we want to talk about the distinction between developed versus developing countries, which is basically the backbone of why there are so many problems in resolving international trade discrepancies, and why do you continuously see this divide between the developed and the developing states. Right? Okay. So let's let me do this. Let me finish the next 3 slides, right, which is quite fast, right? And then we'll take a break at that point. Okay. So this is where you have the motivation of creating the trade related international organization. It was actually not supposed to be GATT. It was supposed to be the International Trade Organization, right? So what happened was it was supposed to come under the auspices of the United Nations, right? And it was supposed to be specialized. It was supposed to, sorry, I'm not mental. It was supposed to be a specialized agency of the UN, right? But what in the end you saw, right, was some complications that arose in the creation of the ITO, right? So there was a rift that occurred during the Havana conference, right? During these multilateral negotiations, and this is like the curse that you see. I just use an analogy of the curse, right? Because this is something that you consistently see throughout, all the different negotiation rounds and the GATT and WTO. The advanced industrialized countries, or your developed states, or your core states, right, always have a different agenda in comparison to the developing countries, right? And let's be fair. I think as a mature thinking student, right, you would be able to see why both of these different categories of actors, right, have or make the demands that they do make. Like, why is that their focus? Why are they interested in this? Because that is what directly affects them. So advanced industrialized countries, they are interested in expanding free trade because they want it, they're already in an advantageous position. Expanding free trade would just then, allow them to continuously, better themselves. The developing countries, particularly at this point, it focused on the former colonies in Latin America. What were they, interested in, right? They were interested in allowing or having an international structure that would contribute to them consolidating their national economies. So, that makes sense. If you're a developing state, right, would you, say that, okay, never mind, let's open up and let, the developed states, freely, pillage our economies and take whatever they need, because that's what we're here for, to serve the interests and the needs and the wants of the developed states. Of course, they're not going to be so gracious like that, because their concern is domestic development, right? So their logic would be for asking for concessions and successfully being able to negotiate for concessions, right? Is premised on the fact that you developed states have already experienced development. You're already experiencing economic growth, right? It is now our turn to do so. You cannot exploit us, right? At your expense. That's the rationale down here. So if you look at it, from each of these states' viewpoints, their demands are technically justified in that sense. Of course, some of them, do they really qualify to be considered as developing states, right? Say like, for example, in the current era, is it fair to continuously define some of these states like China and so on, right, as still being considered as developing, right? China, India, like some of the BRICS states, for instance, right? Is it fair to generally slap that kind of labels on them, in comparison to some of these states which are really small and genuinely really developing, right? So that is something you want to think about also, right? But the logic here is that look at the rationale for demanding or requesting, right, these kinds of concessions, right, when they're negotiating with each other. So go back to the idea of if these developing states do not successfully negotiate for these concessions, then they would definitely be eaten up, right, by the developed states in the world jungle of trade. So if you didn't explain that logic at the beginning of the discussion, right, then I think this part here, when you start talking about the negotiations and the demands for the concessions and so on, it would not be such a complete answer. Okay, all right. And then finally, right, you have the Draft ITO Charter. So over and above all of these negotiations, you have the Draft ITO Charter, right? And what you basically saw, right, is as usual, when they create all of these organizations, right, the ambitions of these organizations in terms of looking at the phrasing in the charter and so on, they are usually very very broad, very sometimes over ambitious. They bite off more they can chew. So basically it extends beyond just simply what is considered to be world trade discipline. But think of it from another perspective. If you're talking about world trade, can you exclude ideas on employment? Can you say that they are independent of each other? can you, not talk about business practices? Can you ignore ideas of international investment or commodity agreements? So while it does seem to be rather ambitious, you will also notice that these are, imperative to international trade in general, right? So that's why we see that, it becomes more and more complex and more complicated. So the charter then starts to include provisions that go beyond, the province of international trade, like, those, relating to economic development and reconstruction. Because how do you cleanly, neatly, divorce all these ideas from each other? It's a bit difficult to do so, right? So we can, to a certain extent, you can understand why, they're being included, right? And what also complicated the issue is not only you have a very complex, charter that has got several different rules and several different provisions, you also have the ratification of the ITO becoming very problematic, as usual, right? Which is a pattern that you saw with the US, right? How it is often seen to be a driving force of development of these organizations. So like what you saw, with the League of Nations, for instance, right? And now you see it, being a driving force of the International Trade Organization. And then you also see it, like, say, for example, the US was a driving force in the creation of the International Criminal Court, right? And helped with the development of the structural framework, right? But does not want to be part of it as a result of it being unhappy with the institutional design, right? And the unhappiness stems from it being unable to ratify it, because you've got opposition to it from the domestic structures, like, in the Congress and so on, because they are considering how this would adversely impact on their abilities to participate in the international structure. So the rationale is that while they push or advocate for an international organization that would help to regulate international trade, they themselves do not want to be subject to these regulations, right? So that is why you see, the unhappiness with institutional design and the opposition in the US Congress, right? And as usual, when you have the superpower, right, not, being comfortable with an organization, then it puts a doubt in many other states or many other countries, right? And they also, subsequently did not ratify the organization in their domestic parliaments. If they do not ratify it, they are unable to sign the charter. If they don't sign the charter, then they are not members of it, right? So that is, where you see that the ITO was basically rendered dead even before it was born, right? And what happens then? You have the GATT, right, that was supposed to act, as a complement to the the ITO, right? So GATT was basically initially intended to act as an addendum to what was supposed to be the ITO under the auspices of the UN. But when you have the death of the ITO even before it was created, what does that do? It left GATT as the only multilateral instrument that governed international trade from 1948 till WTO was established in 1995. It was only supposed to be an addendum, right? So that means, the idea here is that, the GATT now has, an additional burden, right? If you look at it, from an analytical perspective, if you look at de jure versus de facto, right? De jure, when you say that position, de jure is position by a legal right, right? De facto is whether by the right or not, like de jure states versus de facto, right? So if you look at it from a de jure perspective, GATT was not an IO; it's just a treaty, right? So because it was simply a treaty, right? The provisions that it had and what it was able to do obviously is much lesser than if it had been an organization or if it was assisting the ITO. So given the failure of the ITO, the GATT basically took shouldered all of this responsibility and burdens, right? And took on a very big coordinating role that it was then it was originally intended to play. Right. If you look at it, from the de facto, perspective, right, GATT's gradual institutionalization, basically convinced a lot of these international diplomats and so on, right, to formally acknowledge that, it just began as a supplementary institution or a transitional institution, right, but eventually it was, seen to be the world's principal organization or principal forum for making, sorry, not organization, principal forum or platform, right? So make sure that when you refer to GATT, right, like, I just made that same mistake, right? I refer to it as an organization. Please do not refer to it as an organization. Call it a forum, call it a platform, right? Call it a site, SITE, right? For making making multilateralism, work, in international trade, right? So, if you do not explain, the rationale behind creating, an organization dedicated to trade, then you will not be able to explain this idea also, that it was so imperative, so important, and yet, it did not have the institutional foundations or the credibility of what, the ITO would have enjoyed, right? Making its work much more complex, much more difficult. Okay, all right. So this one, basically, we've got, several different, ideas related to what, the background of GATT actually was, right? So you've got, a lot of these countries talking about reducing barriers to entry, right, and wanting to make adjustments to the legacy of protectionism, right, which was basically firmly in place, right, up till about the 1930s. So from the get-go itself, they basically looked at how they can have these tariff concessions, right, and it affected about 1/5 of the world's total, right, and subsequently, it was signed in 1947, right, and came into effect by 1948. So please, can you please indicate in your notes, right, do not forget to discuss the background, right, of GATT, even if you're discussing WTO, right, I think, it will still be important to discuss the relevance of GATT. Okay, all right. Okay, let's take a break at this point. The time is 1:28. Okay, I'll take it as 1:13. Come back at 1:45. right, come back at 1:45. All right, go for your break. Come back at 1:45. All right. So when you look at how GATT works, right? Okay, I would like you to make a reference, to Krasner's application of the regime concept to GATT, because Stephen Krasner, right, is the one who developed the idea, or is the one we need to refer to when we talk about regimes, right? Sorry. So, sorry. One second. So when you refer to GATT, right, please go back to the original definition of what regimes are. So remember the definition: sets of implicit, explicit principles, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures around which actors' expectations converge in a given area of international relations. Please put the definition down in your exam answer. Students do not do that. And I noticed that in particular, when they give a definition of regimes, right, they do mention, if they do give the definition, they will mention like principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures. But I noticed that we always forget to mention the aspect of around which actors' expectations converge in a given area of international relations. If you just refer to principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, you do not refer to actors' expectations converging, you do not refer to a given specific area, if you do not mention the idea of codification, because that's what actors' expectations converging, basically refers to, right? It ends up, how do you guarantee, how do you guarantee another state complying? It has to be codified somewhere, right? So that's the rationale. If you do not mention all of this, then you're not actually referring to a regime. If you just refer to principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, right? What does it refer to? It refers to institutions, right? So institutions, remember the diagram that I drew that is in your notes in lecture 4, that triangle diagram that shows you at the bottom is institutions, in the middle tier is regimes, at the top tier is IOs. That triangle basically tells you that you can have the crystallization of institutions, that the codification, not crystallization. The codification of institutions is what you see being embodied in a regime, and a regime can morph into an international organization, like what we see the morphing of GATT into an IO, right? So if you just simply refer to decision-making procedures, rules, norms, and principles, then you're not talking about a regime. You're basically inaccurately describing institutions simply. All right, so that is why it's important. It's not because not because I want to be fussy, right? And I insist, that you write according to my style. I don't know where people get this idea from, that we are asking you to follow a particular style of writing because we are fussy and that's how we like it to be written. That's not what it is, right? It is about making sure that your answers are accurate. So in the case of GATT, right, it embodied what a regime basically is about, right? Because if you're looking at principles, right, then GATT is operating on the basis of liberal principles and how you're going to maximize global welfare by ensuring that developed and developing states are able to participate effectively in global trade, right? And that is has got barriers to entry removed. So that's what maximizing global welfare via free trade refers to. The norms, right, would be the idea of the what are the basic standards of behavior, right? So the basic standard of behavior, if you look at free trade, what do you need? What is the standard behavior that is required of states who are participating in free trade? Removal of barriers of entry, right? Or at least reducing significantly the number of barriers to entry, right? So that's why you have the idea of reducing the number of quotas, taxes, tariffs, and trying to make imports cheaper, right? Rules, right, would be the perennial problem that exists between the developed and the developing states, right? So the rules generally, you see, a different set of rules being demanded in application to the third world or the developing states, call it the developing states, right? That constantly say we are different. Our requirements and preferences are different from the developed states as a result of the economic status that we're experiencing. And then your decision-making procedures would be the ideas of what are the different ways that GATT makes decisions, and eventually how does this become crystallized in the WTO. So the regime basically introduced three different major principles of standards, right? Basically non-discrimination, liberalization, and reciprocity. Okay. So basically, when you look at the ideas behind GATT and WTO, you would see actually quite similar principles, right? When you look at, say, the standard non-discrimination and so on, the most favored nation status, right, applies to WTO also. So there, this is why we are looking at GATT first, because some of the institutional structures that were created during the time of GATT, you would see being replicated in WTO as well, right? So this one is one of the most important ones, right? So what you can do, right, is that depending on the time that you have, or depending on what the focus of your exam answer is, you can mention that these are the three major substantive principles, which include non-discrimination, liberalization, and reciprocity. Right? If you have the time, of course, then I would say elaborate on all the three, like what I'm elaborating in the slides down here. Otherwise, maybe you could have brief elaborations of the other two, and maybe focus a little bit more on this one, because this is one of the most significant principles that is a standard. Everybody basically they talk about WTO and GATT, right? They will more or less refer to the most favored nation state, most favored nation status. So I would say describe all three, to be on the safe side, right? But if at any point you find yourself running out of time and you need to quickly put things down, at least make mention of the other two, and then go on to elaborate at least one of it in a bit more detail, right? This wouldn't be my natural course of action, but this could be a way to work around a limited time period. But I think you have a lot of time to write exam answer, especially if you're going to have an online exam, right? I think you have an online exam last year was, I think, 6 hours, if I remember correctly, which is actually ample time. It's double the time that you would have if you are writing an exam physical on-site, a physical exam, which is only 1 hour per question, so which is a total of 3 hours. I remember last year's paper, I think, was 6 hours. And still I had students who come to tell me they didn't have time to finish, which I'm like, that means you spend a lot of time flipping through your notes, right? Or your notes are not condensed enough that you need to spend time to read and then take out certain things and put it in. So think about all of these things when you're strategizing for the exam. All right, the Mfn status, right? Basically, what you're referring to is that the treatment of a product, right, when it's being sold, that means under a particular trade condition, it should be extended to all trading partners, right? You cannot have a scenario where you are a member of GATT, right, or subsequently a member of WTO, where you say that I'm selling, say, for example, corn, right, and I'm only going to extend this reduced price of the corn, or a reduced barrier of entry to the corn industry only to a couple of states, like only to my friends, and not to all states, right? So that's the rationale now here. It has to be a scenario for extending the concessions, right, to all trading partners. So basically, you're looking at treating all the trading partners in an equal fashion, regardless of whether you are developed or developing. So I would say that increases the attractiveness of GATT, particularly to developing states, right, because they are going to be on their own. Without this organization, right, that puts in place these kinds of principles, right, would they be able to extract these kinds of non-discriminatory trading practices and principles and concessions from the other states that they're working with, especially if they're dealing with developed states or richer states? Are they going to be able to do so? We already established the fact that there's an unequal status between developed and developing states when we looked at the discussion just now on the core, periphery, and semi-periphery, where we talked about how the core states engage in exploitative, extractive practices. So without an organization in the middle, functioning as a neutral party that helps to negotiate, number one. Number two, that places all of these states, regardless of their status, on an equal platform, giving them a voice in that wild world jungle of trade. The regulation, right, is now very critical to making GATT attractive to an increasing number of states. And counterintuitively or counterproductively, the increased attractiveness of GATT eventually becomes a burden, because the more states it brings on, the more issues that are laid on the table, the more complex negotiations become. Right, so it is a case where all of these different ideas are connected to each other. Can you see? It's like as if you are crocheting something, right? You crochet one thing, and then you link it to another thing. You link it to another thing, and then you just get a whole an entire shawl. That's the logic down here. They're all interconnected, right? One thing leads to another thing. All right. So the most favored nation principle is something that you will see subsequently as well in WTO, right? Then you've got the standard of liberalization, right? So basically, it is very significant to explain this one, because you're talking about the removal or reduction, the significant reduction of all of these barriers to entry, tariff and non-tariff trade barriers. So you can either refer to it as barriers to entry, or you can refer to it as tariff and non-tariff trade barriers. And this is also significant because you cannot have states that are trying to game the system by adding additional taxes onto a nationally produced good or foreign produced goods and so on. Then you've got the final one, which is the standard of reciprocity, right? Which is the issue of ensuring that the trade agreements are all designed to generate benefits on an equal platform for all the different parties involved, right? So it's very important to be able to explain that consistently all of these principles refer to almost the same understanding, or the same principles, right? It's underscored by the same idea that you want to ensure that you are leveling the playing field, right? So the obligation on contracting parties is to generate all of these trade agreements that will benefit everybody. So the rationale is to not have the stronger states, right, being able to use any kind of leverage to extract any kind of concessions, from the weaker states, right? which then would, if you do not regulate this idea of extracting concessions, then the problem is that it would be of absolutely no point having an organization like this, because then you would actually be contributing to perpetuating the discrepancy between the weaker states and the stronger states, right? So that is the rationale down here, right? So you notice all of these principles, right? They go towards the same idea of attempting to level the playing field, reduce the amount of discrepancy that you see between the developed states and the developing states, okay? All right, then what you see, of course, there's no exam answer that would be complete if you do not discuss the different negotiation rounds, right? So you've got 7 trade rounds. The 8th round is what culminated in the creation, in the creation of the sorry, in the creation of the WTO. So basically, what you see is that the aim of all of these negotiation rounds, right, is attempting. The aim is to put all of the different items on the table for discussion, right? So each of these rounds, some of these rounds have a focus on particular themes. Some of these rounds, specifically want to sort out kinks, right? Say for example, relating to agricultural produce, or relating to manufactured goods, relating to luxury goods, and so on, right? So you've got several different rounds, right? So make sure that you are able to list out at least some of the significant rounds. Just have a brief discussion, right? It doesn't have to be so much detail. So what you start to see, right, is the different rounds and what the different rounds became known for, right? That's why I highlighted particular rounds only. So you have the Kennedy rounds, right, and what you have is that an expansion onto the GATT agenda. So 2 things that we already are looking at. Number 1, right, we're looking at how the burden that GATT is experiencing, right, increases with ironically how attractive it is to the developing states, because you get more and more members coming onto the the membership panel, right? Secondly, when you start to see more subjects or more items being added, or more sectors, industry areas, however you want to describe it, more of these added on to the agenda, right? So for example, if you look at the Kennedy round, right, the Kennedy round is significant because that was where you have the first anti-dumping agreement, right? I know this is very economics oriented, but actually it's very simple. Just don't look at, you see, the first problem, right, and this is something that I personally experienced also. If you're not a maths person, and you all know I'm not a maths person, we tend to have a general fear of anything that is related to economics, because there's a misunderstanding that these two are connected, all to do with numbers, right? So number 1, you cannot fear these economic terms. Number 2, just look for the basic understanding of what these terms actually are. You do not need, this is not macroeconomics or microeconomics where you need to explain all of these economics terms in detail. Just look at what the basic definitions are. Wherever I can, I've given you the basic explanations, right? Or just Google it, use a Wikipedia definition if you need additional explanation on these economic terms. But without explaining them, then your answer also will fall flat, right? So just give brief explanation, like how I've done, like on this slide down here in the bracket, right? What does anti-dumping refer to? Directed at forbidding the export of products to foreign markets for prices below those charged on the home market. Very simply, what you see is that some of these developed countries, right, or developed states, they say, for example, if they're producing a good or an agricultural product, which is the same product that is being produced in another state. So, for example, let's just take US and say a Latin American state. Okay, so the US and the Latin American state are both producing corn, for instance, right? Okay, you can tell corn is one of my favorite grains, right? Because I keep using this as a reference point. Anyway, so if they're producing corn, and this was an actual case, if I remember correctly, I think it was either corn or cotton, I cannot remember, but I remember it was either one of these products. And what happens is that as a result of it producing corn, what the US did was it exported the corn to one of these Latin American states, and it basically flooded the market, right, with the sheer volume of the corn being exported. Number 1. Number 2, it also sold the corn at a very low price, right? So the rationale is that when you sell it at a very low price, the domestic consumers in the Latin American state, right, are they going to be buying their domestically produced corn, or are they going to be buying the cheaper US produced corn? Of course, they were going to buy the cheaper US produced corn, right? So, in some cases, you have people who say that it's a foreign product that is being sold at a cheaper price, or, simply, I'll just buy whatever that is cheaper for me. I don't care where it's being produced. So the rationale is that you basically flood the industry, and that basically kills off some of the nascent struggling industries, makes it more difficult for them to survive, right? So that is the rationale down here. So they need to prevent larger developed states from actually dumping, right, in these poorer states, right? So that is one aspect. Then discussion of development as a trade concern, similar to what I discussed with you earlier on about the social aspects of development and so on. Okay, not simply just looking at economic development in terms of GDP growth or PPP and so on. But what you start to notice, right, when from the Kennedy round onwards, right, is that the trade negotiations, as a result of increasing the number of subjects onto the agenda, actually now take significantly longer to complete. Say, for example, the Kennedy round, right, basically took about 3 years, right, 1964 to 67. Then what you see, right, is that the Tokyo round took about 6 years. The Uruguay round took 7.5 years. right? So cannot solve, right? It takes that many years, right? Because they cannot come to any kind of conclusion, right, in the negotiations that they are making, and therefore the negotiations continue to, go on and on and on. So that is what becomes problematic, and if it's going to take such a long period of time to resolve, then it casts questions, right, on how effective the organization actually is, right? Okay, so then you've got the Tokyo Round, right? That was from 1973 to 1979. This one was only the 6-year ones, right? And this one, why is it significant? If the first one that we discussed, the Kennedy Round, was significant because of the anti-dumping policy breakthrough, the Tokyo Round becomes significant because you are looking at the doubling of GATT membership within the decade, right? From 62 to 102 states. So that, like what I already mentioned to you, anytime you have an increase in the number of states that are forming the organization or forming, the membership, right, that is going to bring about several complications, because the more states that come on board, the more problems they bring. That's the reason why they're coming on board, because they're all experiencing problems, on the home ground, right? So that is the rationale down here. The more members you have, the more complex the organization becomes, because all of them, especially in organizations like this, right, where basically everyone has got a voice. Unlike what you see in the IMF and World Bank, where this, the volume of their voice or the impact that they can make is determined by their status in the global economy. So the US, being one of the most powerful states economically and politically and militarily, basically has got the largest voice, pays the highest subscription quota, but also has the largest voice, or one of the largest voice in the IMF and in the World Bank, right? But here it's slightly different, right? Everybody basically has a voice. So the more number of the higher the number of members, right, the more complex negotiations can become. So that's why you also see, the negotiations becoming longer and longer, right, because there are more members who are trying to extract concessions. Of course, all of these states, right, are going to be trying to extract concessions, because that is what, the organization is about. It is about trying to level off the playing field between the developed and the developing states, right? So where you see is, series of arrangements committing contracting parties to, basically curtail the use of these barriers as instruments of protection, because you keep seeing, what do you see? Look at the time period. 1970s. What do you also see in the 1970s? What was significant in the 1970s? What was significant in the 1970s? What characterized? Anyone? One is that generally you start to see more and more states, coming on board the globalization bandwagon. There's no real start point to globalization, but generally a lot of scholars agree that, you see a lot of states, jumping onto the globalization bandwagon. But what do you see specifically in the 1970s? Anyone? Nobody? No. Democratization is something that occurs generally, across the board in several periods. Cold War is 1940, post-World War II period until about 1991. So, how does the Cold War figure into this? Non-tariff trade barriers. Yeah, correct. You're going towards the idea of the oil crisis. 1973 to 1975, right, is also known as the recession. They had a major, what they call, economic crisis of the 1970s, also referred to great inflation of the 1970s. Basically it's an inflation crisis, right? And or some scholars would refer to it as stagflation, right? So that's the idea down here. So the time period is also important. Notice, you will, even when you look at, say, EU, for instance, right? Some of the developments in the EU also, are characterized by the conditions of the international system at that point, right? So of course you're going to see, states attempt, if the international system is experiencing or has experienced economic crisis or inflation, and so that's a general trend that a lot of states are experiencing, right? Then of course a lot of states are going to revert to instituting barriers of entry, because they are in an inflation and subsequently after inflation or economic crisis. What do states generally do? They revert to protectionism, right? They will laud free trade, right? And then when you have enough of the the invisible hand of the market regulating free trade and basically wreaking havoc on all of these industries, then they realize we need to engage in re-regulation. So that's why you see periods of deregulation, right, reducing barriers of entry and reducing the heavy hand that the state plays, and periods of re-regulation, right? It goes back and forth. So that's why in the early 2000s, after the Asian financial crisis, for instance, right, when you look at a lot of media headlines, they always, or editorials, relating to economics, right, what you will see is that, I'm quite sure you've seen this phrase before, wither protectionism or neo-protectionism, right? These kinds of phrases, basically they say that, there's a resurgence of these kinds of practices all over again. You understand? All right. So that is why it is important to pay attention to the timeline also, because that corresponds to the developments that occur in these organizations. Okay. All right. So in another issue that you tend to notice when you look at this period is that in a sense, right, you tend to see organizations shifting away from the true spirit of of GATT. Sorry, the regime. GATT is not organization. I keep saying organization, which I cannot afford for you to do. In the true spirit of what the regime was supposed to be a reference to, which was multilateralism, right? You see plurilateral negotiations being or arrangements being conducted, right? What does plurilateralism refer to, right? Basically, the idea is that all of these states are members, right, in this major structure, right? And then what happens is that they tend to break into smaller groups, right, within this structure that they exist in, right? So, rather than to have negotiations among several of, this members, right, they break into smaller groups. So, it's more than two, of course, it's not bilateral, because bilateral would be two, right? So it's more than two states, but not as many as would be seen, in a multilateral structure or a framework. So what they do is that they formulate these like-minded states, right? These smaller groups of like-minded states, or, having similar preferences or having similar structures, domestically, right, or similar status, for instance, right, they formulate or negotiate or influence each other in a smaller group setting outside the multilateral framework, right? So in this case, you start to see the discrepancies among the preferences states, right, within GATT. Right, so some countries may have been more willing to move forward with liberalization of the economy. Some others may not be so willing to do so. But these are separate engagements, right? Of course, these plurilateral arrangements, they subscribe to on more of a voluntary basis. Only a few contracting parties, as opposed to what you see in a multilateral framework. But the problem here, right, is that why I'm even emphasizing on the idea of plurilateralism is that it's not always advantageous. Right, it may be advantageous to particular states, who will be able to extract concessions or negotiate better in this smaller group, right? But the problem is that if you consistently have states who are going to ignore, right, the overall structure and use the IO to further particular things on the agenda, that means the IO or the regime, right, is not they're not using it to fulfill fulfill the goals of the IO or the regime, and they're using it just to let's just as a platform for them to come together and then have their own negotiations. Then it becomes very problematic, right? Like firstly, it can undermine the trading system because it's diverting issues away from the more complex or more complicated or more difficult multilateral negotiations. Because now, instead of looking at what all of these different members have, what are the problems that all of them have, right, you're just looking at how to solve your own problem, right? So it's okay. Say for example, the best analogy I can think of is that we have this class, right? But if the lecturer decides to have lectures and tutorials for only like 10 out of the whole class, 10 students, right, focusing only on these 10 students, then it doesn't solve the problems that the rest of the students would have. It doesn't enhance the knowledge of the rest of the students. Only these 10 students are benefiting, and that undermines the meaning of what having a lecture is all about. Correct? That's the same logic, lah. Okay, that means it's like specialized treatment, and it undermines the main goal of everybody coming together to start off with. All right, so that is the logic down here. All right, second one, the second problem with it is that it discourages states from making multilateral concessions, which is grounded in ideas of equity, leveling the playing field, right? So it is basically counterproductive. You are supposed, that is what the regime is about. That is what GATT is about, right? Leveling the playing field. But you are now saying that, oh, there's an option for me not to make all of these concessions, and I can now, get whatever I want by joining this little group, right? This little plurilateral group, and I don't have to now make these concessions that would make it fairer for me to engage in trade with these developing states. So of course you realize that these plurilateral negotiations would also stand to benefit the developed states a little bit more. All right, so basically say for example, if Vietnam, Japan, and South Korea, they sign plurilateral deals on reducing tariffs, right? Then, obviously Vietnam would be, less interested in the multilateral agreement to reduce tariffs for everyone, because that would basically dilute, the advantage that it has with Japan and South Korea, right? So, obviously the logic is that the more states that are in, this tent, the more states that, they are negotiating with, right, the lesser the advantages or the, power they would have, because now I have to extend these same concessions to everybody. Because remember, what is the foundation of GATT and WTO? The most favored nation status, the principle of reciprocity, right? Standardization, liberalization, and so on, right? So if I extend concessions to one, I have to extend concessions to everybody. The lesser number of states I extend concessions to, right, they would deem it to be advantageous, because I do not have to make it cheaper for so many actors. I make it cheaper only for certain actors, and I really want to only trade, say for example, with these two particular states. Maybe I only want to trade with Japan and South Korea. Why do I want to? If I'm wearing my realist lenses, right? Why would I want to extend my concessions to everybody else and make it easier for everyone else? I'm interested only myself. Right, I'm interested in developing my own economy, especially if I already think that I know I'm already at a disadvantageous position, right? So I just want to, do my thing and get moving. Basically, if you want to, put it in very layman terms. So then it discourages states from actually participating in the true spirit of what free trade is all about, or trade liberalization is all about. So that is why plurilateralism, right, can be complicated and can actually create, larger problems in the long run. In the short run, it is beneficial for all of these states who are looking, to say that, I quickly want to extract these concessions and, have negotiations with more like-minded, like status, organizations, right? That's the logic down here. Okay, all right. Then you go on to the Uruguay round, right? And basically with the Uruguay round, you find that it is unfortunately, beset with a lot of drama, right? And it was, and that's the one that took 7.5 years to complete, right? And this was the last round under GATT per se. So what happened was you had a lot of continuous stalling, because of all the different subjects that were placed on the the agenda, right? Textiles, clothing, agriculture, all these tropical products, and so on. And then what you also start to see, right, is that previously you did not really see the subject of intellectual property being placed on the agenda, right? But subsequently in the later rounds, right, you find intellectual property becomes a very significant, a part of the agenda, right? Especially in WTO. So we'll look at that next week. So basically, what you see is that the complexities of the round, right, and the stalling of the negotiations and unable to basically iron out all the different kinks, right? Basically, highlighted to the international community. Look, GATT is basically not in a position to enforce any of these negotiations. It cannot, it's not possible for it to continue anymore. If your international trading community is serious about ensuring that you're leveling the playing field and making international trade free and fair, right? You need to have an improvisation of the structure, the internal structure, not domestic, the internal structure of the regime, and the regime is no longer cannot bear the burden of all of these negotiations anymore, right? So basically, what you saw was that was a huge deadlock, particularly in the area of agricultural reform, right? And the fear was that after these 10 ministerial conferences, and they still could not resolve agricultural reform, and this has a spillover effect into WTO also. When you look at WTO and some of the negotiation rounds, right, you will notice that agriculture always seems to be the stumbling block, right, an obstacle to being resolved. So the biggest deadlock was over agricultural reform in the Uruguay round, right? Maybe you want to include that in your notes. Right, and the fear was that if you cannot solve this, if you cannot overcome this obstacle, right, then the legitimacy of GATT, which basically already overstepped its boundaries, right, in the best way possible, because it took the space of what was supposed to have been the International Trade Organization, right, and it simply filled the shoes, right, without even having the structure in place, because it was simply a regime, right, and therefore the legitimacy of GATT, which was the only representation of an international structure that would tackle the problems associated with international trade, it would just totally undermine it altogether. So that's when they decided, okay, we need to have a shift from GATT to creating an international organization. So that's where you get the WTO being created. All right, so this is what GATT was basically all about. Then now we look at the institutional effects of GATT, right? I'm only going to run through some of the points, because basically the details are all here for you. It's in Kant's Mfn Status as well as in the additional document I uploaded for you, the principal history of GATT and WTO. All right. So basically, what you want to highlight is that GATT was concerned initially with tariffs, right, and then subsequently GATT was also very concerned with as a result of all the negotiations in the different rounds with the liberalization of international trade. So what you want to highlight is that it had a package approach to negotiating the trade rules. So number one, it looks at multi-sector agreements, right? So basically you tag on these different sectors. So if you make a negotiation in say intellectual property, then that will be connected to say labor or manufacturing, right? Because it's like a package approach, right? Then you also have a scenario where this packaging, the packaging of all of these different subjects, right? I think you can call them subjects or you can call them items on the agenda, right? So basically, what happens is that if you tag these different subjects together, then it will be easier to make extract concessions or negotiate on the other fields that are being or other items that are being tagged on. So that means say for example, if you link agricultural products, right, to say labor, for instance. I'm just giving you a random example, right? You link agricultural products to say labor, right? Then you say, okay, if you make concessions in agricultural products, then I'll be able to give you a concession in labor. So it's like trying to sweeten the deal. If they didn't do that, right, then particularly the more difficult fields to extract concessions in or negotiate on would be very difficult. So like that's why we say liberalization in agricultural sector, right? During the Uruguay Round, if they didn't put it in the package, right, they wouldn't have been able to make any headway at all. Right, that's the rationale down here, right? And then the single sector deals, right, also reduce a lot of the transactions, right, involved in managing more of the comprehensive negotiations. So specifically, what you're looking at is that under when you shift towards the WTO and looking at the time period, so the 1990s, where the internet starts to become relevant, where things in technological advances in telecoms, in financial services, which are all taking on an platform, right, e-governance and so on, right, that starts to become more significant under when it was shifting from GATT to the WTO. So basically, what can you link this to? If you want to make the discussion more analytical as opposed to just explaining it straightforward, you can say it's the effects of globalization, right? Because that is what results in increased trade volumes, right? Because you have more and more states who are coming on board, more and more states participating in international trade. So you've got more complex trading across different borders. Number two. Number three, right, you've got the emergence of the newer trade sectors like financial services, intellectual property, changes in telecommunications as a result of increases in technology and so on, right? So this is, that's why I say the timeline is also important, to include or to look at it, because the timeline helps you to point to particular trends and developments. So, when you point to particular trends and developments like oil crisis or the Great, Depression or the Great Inflation Crisis of the 1970s or, the advent of, e-governance structures, the use of technology or, the forces or the drivers of globalization, an increase in the opening up of states, particularly who, like, the East Asian states or the Latin American states who are undergoing industrialization and development, rapid industrialization and development at this period. So each of these time periods become significant to help you, understand what are the different, trends that are occurring in the international system. And that is why you see particular developments, or that is why you see states wearing their realist lenses or reverting to wearing their realist lenses, or why states are weary, right, of participating and making concessions or negotiating on a particular level, right? So that is what you need to be able to explain, or certain trends that are occurring domestically. So like when you look at WTO next week, right, and you look at the timing and the negotiations that, say for example, India tried to extract on the agricultural in the agricultural sector, right, you will notice that the timing is coincides with major domestic elections, right, and how the domestic elections and wanting to appeal to the domestic electorate would make an impact on the way the leaders are negotiating on a global platform, because they don't want to be seen as selling out their country or selling out their farmers on a global level, right? So that is why you need to think about the time frame. You need to think about what the trends are, right, in order to make an analytical explanation, right, rather than just descriptive. Okay, so basically GATT has seen a drastic rise in the number of members, right, and then it became very obvious, right, by the 1980s and the end of the Uruguay Round, which is about 1994, right, you find that it is a scenario where GATT was unable to continue bearing the burden anymore. And like what I mentioned to you, the economic downturn of the 1970s and the Great Inflation, right, basically caused states to revert to protectionism. So what you can refer to as neo-protectionism, neo-protectionism, or you can say resurgence of protectionist measures, which starts to undo a lot of the advancements that GATT basically was able to create for these states with relation to international trade. So they realized that, okay, we need to shift away from the regime and create an organization. So that's where you get the WTO. Okay, all right. So basically, what you want to highlight, like how we always say 21st century problems, right? So, now we refer to this idea of 21st century trade. We already laid the foundations for it. We already explained that there are changes in the types of items that are going onto the agenda. It is being driven by, technological advances or, shift to e-platforms, right? For in terms of IPO or in terms of services, financial services, and so on, right? So that's basically, the idea when you want to describe the idea of 21st century trade, right? So what you had, is that there were different levels of commitments for the developing and developed states, right? But as you start to see the developing states play catch up, right, by industrialization, this clear-cut dichotomy, remember the dichotomy is like this clear-cut difference, black and white, between two different sectors, right? The dichotomy becomes, less and less apparent, right? But, you still see the discrepancy between the North and the South, global North and the global South, right? Or the developed and developing in terms of the richer countries consistently, are being able to pay for opt-outs, right? They can compensate. So as a result of them being richer, they can wheedle, out of, certain, regulations that would otherwise hurt, the new rules, hurt the sectors that are having new rules being imposed on, right? Or as a result of them mooting a lot of these negotiations in the periods before you had an expansion of membership and before you had all of these other developing countries come on board, right? They already have been able to extract exemptions, from the previous trading round. So they are already consistently in a more advantageous position. So, this is why you never ever see this gap, being closed between the developed and the developing states, right? And therefore, you needed a more bullish approach, right? To basically confront all of these built-in privileges, right? And why? Because if you do not address these built-in privileges, then they would not be able to, extract any kind of concessions or make it fairer for the poorer developing countries. So then, it just goes back to square one all over again. So it's pointless, right? And then also you start to see in the, in the 21st century, right? The trade agenda now starts to include, the ideas of mega regionals. So it's no longer something that, at one time, all you heard about, in a lot of these international, magazines and so on was, the idea of free trade. You kept seeing free trade agreement, little exclusive little clubs. Subsequently, right, when you look at things today, you understand these ideas in terms of mega regions like your TPP or your CTPP and so on. Okay, and then where you still find discrepancies is that the interests of the richer developed countries, they're still dominating this now regulated jungle of world trade, right? It's not to say that there have not been any positive results, or not to say that no advancements have been made, but you still see that GATT was unable to close the gap. GATT was unable to close the gap, right, between the richer developed countries, right? So, particularly like, say, for example, agricultural sectors, manufacturing, right, basically face these two sectors, right, face, very competitive challenges. And then, the agricultural sector is, made more complex by, say, for example, climate change, right, deteriorating soil health, biological diversity loss, water security or scarcity of fresh water. So, these old trade issues, they're not going to go anywhere, even if you have got technological, transformation occurring, because you still have, agriculture is already a sensitive area, and then now you are being confounded by these newer problems that are affecting agriculture. So it makes it more difficult for these states who are reliant on the agricultural sector, because there are more and more complexities associated with the sector on a domestic level, right? So this is why, again, the timeline is also important. Just like how we are today saying that if we don't address climate change today, then there's very little time left for us, right? Like predictions say like by 2030, right, XYZ will run out. You are already seeing the pronounced effects of climate change. That's basically what you see in 21st century, right? Long-standing effects that haven't been resolved, and then now this complicates, the way states, are being, are trying to, resolve these issues associated with the agricultural sector, right? So basically, what you're saying is like, there's very little to complain about GATT. I think it'd be very unfair for students to write a negative critique of GATT, because basically it performed all the functions and more, right, that was required of it, simply being a regime. So when you talk about how you have a need to shift from GATT as a regime to an international organization such as the WTO, what you want to highlight is not because it is pathology of GATT. That means it was not a case where GATT was inadequate, or GATT was not doing what it was supposed to do, right? But more a case where you have the inherent flaws of the international trading environment or the architecture, and the flaws, right, that are seen as a result of states, reiterating the need to protect their own industries, richer states being selfish, right, and continuing to function in an extractive, exploitative manner, and so on. That is basically what contributed to the need to shift from GATT as a regime to WTO as an organization, right? So that is what you want to say. So I think, like I said, maybe you want to write this down, right? I think it'd be unfair to criticize GATT and say that that it was a failure. Right, it was a failure. I wouldn't say GATT is a failure per se, because the performances technically seem to be very positive. Without GATT, right, you wouldn't have been able to see any of the advancements that were made in international trading environment, and you would have basically seen all the smaller developing states being eaten up by the larger states. If you think the situation is dire now, right, it would have been even more dire without GATT. So I think that is how you need to phrase the discussion angle. right? And what you can refer to is that basically get there's proof, right, to highlight that it helped to make the international trading environment more conducive, because you basically see a vast growth in terms of volume of international trade. Okay, all right. So that's why sometimes like say when we did IMF and World Bank, basically we trashed it by talking about the problems that are associated with the structure adjustment programs, right, in both the organizations, right? So certain organizations or certain topics, right, you can calibrate your response and you can afford to take a harsher, more critical stance, right? In other organizations, it's difficult to do so because there's very little ground. So don't automatically have this attitude that you need to basically tear the organization apart. Okay. All right. When you look at the shortcomings, of course you need to explain the shortcomings. But like I said, it's shortcomings rather than to say institutional weakness or pathology. Right, so basically, remember we talked about the de jure and the de facto, right? So it did not have any legal powers. Already we see international organizations not having legal binding powers to enforce, particular structures or particular negotiations or resolutions on states as a result of states being sovereign, right? And what more of a regime, right? So I already cannot do it, but what more of a regime, right? So it didn't have any legal powers to enforce any of these resolutions. It was obviously not a formal organization. So like what you see in IMF and World Bank, where you have voting rounds and resolutions being put forth, right? This is not a feature of all the negotiation rounds because it's not a formal organization. It's simply like a conference or a meeting, a negotiation, right? This obviously did not have a dispute resolution mechanism, right? So that is also another thing that hampers. Automatically, remember when we talked about trading organizations or just even you talk about increased interactions among states, you need to have a dispute resolution mechanism. What more when you talk about trading, obviously, and then trading in environment where you have vast discrepancies between the developed and the developing states. So that also becomes problematic. In a regime, you do not see a permanent secretariat or a bureaucracy or a physical headquarters like how you would see with an international organization. So in this case, the amount of power it has in terms of having a strong bureaucracy, a technocratic bureaucracy, right, that would be able to also have negotiations with other outside actors, external actors, like what you see with some of the other organizations, IMF, World Bank, EU, right, has the connections, UN has the connections and collaborations, with other external actors, and you did not see that occurring with GATT, and all of this comes down to the fact that it's not an organization, it is simply a regime, right? And then of course, like what we discussed, agricultural trade was something that was not, being able to be resolved, right? And then you also had preferential trade agreements, right? A shift from the multilateral approach, right, to the plurilateral approach that some of the states were more willing to engage in as a result of trying to make conditions more favorable to themselves, because as we say, the states are always wearing their realist lenses, right? Then the impact of the environment, right, which is the 70s and the 80s, sluggish growth, inflation, and the idea that when you're already in a disadvantaged position and then there's a global economic crisis, who is the one that stands to be disadvantaged even further? It's going to be the developing countries. So the developing countries started to ignore the GATT rules altogether. They did whatever they could. They scrambled, and did whatever they could to save their own domestic industries and nascent industries and so on. So they could not comply with the structural adjustments that were being recommended by GATT as a result of the negotiations, right? And then subsequently you see that like the oil crisis and economic turbulence, right, saw very few countries being willing to sign the agreements during the Tokyo Round, which is why it took that many years, 6 years for the Tokyo Round. And basically, you have a return to protectionism, right? So basically, a lot of these issues that occurred in the international environment then contributed to undoing a lot of the good that GATT had already, had done for the international system. So that becomes very problematic. Right. So, before I go there, right, when you talk about the 1970s, right, specific instances that you can refer to, like what I mentioned to you, the inflation, right, the great inflation of the 1970s. Then you've got the oil crisis of 1973. You've got 1979 energy crisis, right? And then, you also have the Iranian Revolution that caused a disruption to the oil supply. Then you also had, 1970s to 1980s recession, right? So very high inflation, right? All of this, had about, long-term effects till about 1985, around that period, right? So that is where you see slowdowns in a lot of these already disadvantaged economies like those in African continent or the Latin American continent. Okay, all right. So there's a scenario where all of these problems confounded, all these problems become exacerbated, right, with GATT not being able to enforce anything as a result of it only having a regime status as opposed to being an international organization. Okay, all right. So like what we highlighted earlier on, right, GATT basically was instrumental in helping to provide the international environment with this basic set of rules relating to international trade, so trading negotiations, trading policies, and the mechanism for implementation, say like the most favored nation status or the principle of reciprocity and so on, right? While it did not have a dispute resolution mechanism, at least it was a forum for disputes, or it was a forum to negotiate lower trade barriers, right? So at least it was a platform. It was maybe not able to enforce anything, but at least it allowed states to come together, right? So you could say that it contributed to global governance in the trade aspect. right? And then what you also saw was that, even though not all of the 8 rounds were entirely successful, what it did contribute to is a better climate for investment and job creation. So you notice all of the points on this slide down here and the next couple of slides, right? They are summaries of, what are the contributions that GATT was able to bring about. So, if you describe just the rounds, they are descriptions. Here we are basically, trying to make the argument analytical by saying, okay, these are the outcomes that we noted as a result of the structure of GATT and so on, right? So you also saw GATT's membership growing from 23 to 128. So the rationale is that even though the increase in number of members, right, complicated the negotiations because it added on several different items to the agenda, you do see that it is actually benefiting the developing countries largely, without which if you didn't have GATT, right, basically you wouldn't have anything for the developing countries to rely on, right? So it's like there's benefit, and you're telling yourself that at least there's this minimal benefit in comparison to like not having any benefit at all. At least this is something that basically contributed to helping to at least make it more bearable, right, in terms of the discrepancy between the developed and the developing states, right? So basically, what you also saw, right, is that while the Uruguay round was the last round and it was seen to be a failure, right, it did it was a very high stakes negotiation, right? So basically what you saw was at least they managed to for a small little regime, right, it at least managed to bring on board 125 countries, right, and try to put very sensitive issues on the negotiating table. Then you also look at around the 1980s to the early 1990s, right, you find that there's also turbulence in the international political atmosphere. So you start to see when you see the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on, right, and then you see the marketization of the former Soviet bloc. So a lot of these states, right, are now beginning to open up. So you have like if you dealt with the first round of opening up and liberalization of states from Africa and Latin America, now you've got those from the former Soviet bloc. So basically what you're looking at is that the flourishing of international trade, right, and GATT basically helped to reassure many of these states, right, it was attempting to promote and regulate international trade, and it was helping to reassure states, right, that just lowering barriers to entry, right, to foreign products did not necessarily mean that they're going to be automatically exploited, right? So that is why we say that it fostered confidence in the international trading system, helped to avoid a repeat of what you saw in the 1930s, basically, right? So it is quite a feat, right, to consider, for simply just a regime, right? Okay. So you look at the Uruguay round as a springboard for the foundation of the WTO, right? So then you can go on to explain, basically what the WTO is about, right? It basically, we want to look at it in terms of GATT being a trailblazer, right? For the foundation of the WTO. So basically, what you see with the WTO is that you start to look at reform, you start to look at eliminating a lot of long-standing restrictions and further negotiations in terms of reducing barriers to entry, and of course the establishment of the dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO, right? Which actually face serious problems, right? In terms of the appellate body, right? When Trump was in power, right? And then subsequently, the appellate body just basically came to a standstill as a result of this. But at least, for that long period of time from the 1990s, up till 2017, 2018, right around that period, that was when we saw the standstill, the destruction of the appellate body as a result of the US not approving any judges to the dispute resolution body, right? So what you want to look at, is how WTO is basically, a new version of what GATT basically was about, right? Because GATT is a regime, WTO is an IO, right? So GATT is basically a series of rules. It's a multilateral agreement, right? In very ad hoc secretariat that was insulated, right? And very different from what WTO is, which is a permanent institution with a physical headquarters and its own secretariat. And then you also have a scenario where GATT didn't have the negotiations being applied on a permanent basis, right? Rather, it was applied on a provisional basis, right? Unlike what you see in the WTO. And then you also have, the rules of GATT applied to trade in goods, right? But when you start to see that transition from GATT to WTO, you start to see, financial services, trade-related, IPO, and other services, being included on the agenda, right? GATT was multilateral instruments, right? But as a result of the trading environment, you started to see GATT, shifting the focus of the members of GATT shifting from multilateralism to plurilateralism, whereas WTO, you do not see the shift at all. It's supposed to be multilateralism, right? Because all of the members are committed to it as a result of it being an international organization, right? GATT was unable to settle the disputes, right? It was just a forum to air the disputes, and therefore, because it cannot legally settle any of the disputes, right, it was actually susceptible to blockages. Whereas, the system of settlement of disputes in WTO is codified, is institutionalized. So therefore, you have, improvements over from GATT in WTO. Okay. All right, so that's basically the idea, that you want to cover. So, whether you get a question on WTO or whether you get an open-ended question, relating to the international trading regime, I would say that, even if the question doesn't specifically mention GATT, but talks about WTO, I think you would need to at least have a a decent discussion, right, in your exam answer relating to how WTO came about and how, you know, GATT basically set the foundations for an international organization to regulate free trade. So I would not discount this chapter or this aspect of the chapter, right, and only concentrate only on WTO. All right, okay. With that, I basically finished, you know, today's discussion. I think this is one of the more, you know, softer, kinder, gentler takes and a more positive, you know, description of any of the organizations that we've looked at, you know, in the entire course, right? But I would say it's instrumental in discussing, you know, if you're going to discuss, you know, international trading regime. All right. So please do not ignore this chapter, all right? Because, you know, if you see the exam questions just talking about, you know, WTO or international trade, then I notice that students tend to only focus on, you know, the newer iteration, which would be WTO. All right. So with that, with 1 minute to go, I will, you know, I kept my promise of not overshotting the time, which I did last week. All right. Okay. So I will see you all next week, likely in class. All right. Please check your timetables. And we will do WTO. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.